All right, two-part thesis statements. So in this video, I'm going to walk us through how to create a more sophisticated version of a thesis statement than what we might be used to from the 5-paragraph essay. So first, I want to just talk about the word thesis. So thesis, without attaching statement to, if we just look at the word thesis, that's just a fancy word or an academic word for argument. And remember, an argument, we don't mean that when we're referring to it with our writing, we don't mean that to suggest that there are two people mad at each other, right? That's how we use it in conversation. Oh, they had an argument. But really, what the word argument means is opinion, an expression of a point of view on something, right? So, therefore, thesis means opinion. So it's important that we state outright at the beginning of our essay, usually at the end of our introduction. So regardless of how long our introduction is, it usually comes at the end of the introduction. But it's a strong declaration, a statement of what you intend to explain in your essay. So what is the argument that you're making about such and such? Or what is the point of view about this topic that you are focusing on in the essay? And so everything else in the essay should support that thesis. The thesis is the main thing that keeps the essay on track, right? So we let our readers know at the beginning of our essay what this essay is going to do, and then we do it, right? So we want to keep that in mind. So let's go back to the 5-paragraph essay structure for a moment just to see where we've been and how the two-part thesis statement is both similar and different than this form of thesis. So in the 5-paragraph essay structure, we state very simply, very straightforwardly what our argument is, and then we list out our 3 supporting reasons for that argument. I have this position because point A, point B, and point C. And then we know that point A will be explored in the first body paragraph, point B will be explored in the second body paragraph, point C will be explored in the third body paragraph, right? Not much complexity there, very straightforward, clear outline of what the essay is going to do. Nothing really complex there. So this is called a listing thesis statement, where we just list out all the supporting reasons we have for a given argument, right? But again, this is a very basic way of crafting an argument. And we are moving beyond that stuff. We are college students. We are more complex than that. So are our arguments and our ideas, and we need to have something that expresses that complexity. So an example of a listing thesis is right here. Americans between the ages of 18 through 34 should vote. So this is the opinion being expressed. Because it's good for the economy, so that's point A. It increases civic engagement, point B. And it's important for younger Americans to have a say in our democracy, point C. So if this were a 5-paragraph essay, we know that the first body paragraph is going to talk about how it's good for the economy. The second will be it increases civic engagement. And then the third will be it's how it's important for younger Americans to express their voice in our democracy, right? Not very complex. A 2-part thesis statement, it takes those general 2 parts, but it just allows for more nuance in them. So the first part is the claim or position, so that hasn't changed. We still clearly express the argument that we're planning to support in the essay. But where it does differ is when we express the reason. So instead of listing out all of our subpoints, what we do is we just give an overarching umbrella reason. So the shape of an umbrella is an arch, right? And so we use that term to suggest that all of our body paragraphs, all the subpoints, all of the things that we're bringing up in the essay should be able to fit underneath that big, large reason. So we're giving our readers right at the beginning the main reason we have that position, but we're not divulging every little detail and every little supporting point and what the whole structure of the essay is. We allow for some wiggle room here. So we want to keep in mind that the overarching umbrella reason should be broad enough to encompass the essay's subpoints, but it should be specific enough to define the scope of the essay, right? So it shouldn't just be totally general and super broad without any specificity, but we just don't need to list out every single subpoint that we have. So keep that in mind. A two-part thesis statement does not list out every supporting reason in the essay. Now, something that a two-part thesis statement will also do, it's not necessarily a clear identifiable component like the claim and the overarching reason. It's just more in the language that you use when you're crafting your thesis. And an effective two-part thesis statement will also hint at or indicate why the essay's focus is important or significant. So why is this argument relevant? Why does it have significance in the world? Why should people care about it? When you indicate that briefly, it helps your readers understand, okay, I get what this person's getting at. Let me read on and see how they support this, how they explicate and expand on these ideas. Now, in the following examples, I color-coded the different components so that we could see. So the claim is blue, the overarching umbrella reason is this green color, and then the essay's significance, or why the thesis is important, is kind of this orange color. So keep that in mind. We'll show you how it works out. So a strong thesis statement will be an answer to a question. A thesis will not be a question, okay? So you use a question to help you figure out what the heck you're trying to argue, but a thesis is not going to be a question. So the question part is behind the scenes stuff. This is what we ask ourselves when we set out to work on the essay, when we set out to do our research and draft and all that behind the scenes, below the surface work that our readers aren't necessarily going to know about. So I have some example questions here, and then I'm going to show you how we can craft a two-part thesis statement to address these questions. So the first question, should big tech be held accountable for the adverse effects their algorithmic apps have on children, teens, and young adults specifically? Should the United States require universal civil service for its young adults? How has the bicycle influenced my perspective on mobility and community? Should pineapple be a topping on pizza? So in these following examples, we're going to show how we can take these questions and turn it into a sophisticated thesis. Now, keep in mind, you can't respond to a question in a reasonable way if you haven't thought about how to respond to it, if you haven't done any research, if you haven't figured out how you feel about that question. So keep that in mind. We don't need to figure out an answer to our question right at the beginning. That's where all of our thinking and research comes into play, figuring out how to do that. Okay, should big tech be held to account for the adverse effects their algorithmic apps have on children, teens, and young adults specifically? Because of the mounting evidence that algorithmic apps are harmful to teens and young adults' mental and emotional health, it is incumbent upon Congress to enact common sense restrictions and regulations on how big tech companies such as Meta, X, and ByteDance can design their apps for use by America's young people. By enacting such common sense regulations, Congress can better ensure the health and prosperity of our country's future leaders. So I color-coded these different elements so that we can see. So the green part here, remember, that's the overarching umbrella reason. So in this case, it actually comes first. So, oh shoot, sorry about that. So it's okay if you switch the order of the two parts. It just matters that they're both there, right? So this is the overarching reason for this particular perspective. So the argument here is that Congress needs to do this because of this, the mounting evidence of this problem. And the orange part here, this is what indicates the significance of this. So we care about our young people. We should, at least. So we want to make sure that they're healthy and they're mentally well and that they're going to be equipped to actually function as a healthy, competent human being in our society, because our society depends on that, right? So that is how we kind of indicate the significance there. Should the United States require universal civil service for its young adults? On the whole, the young people of the United States have suffered immense trauma and disruption from the lasting effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, in many cases leading to isolation, disillusionment, and even despair. As a country, we owe our young people a fighting chance to achieve the life they want for themselves. While the military may not be a viable option for many of these young people, mandatory civil service of some variety will enable these young people to secure valuable job training and a stronger sense of purpose in a fractured and confusing world. So again, this I put the reason, the overarching umbrella reason first. So that comes first in this construction. And the orange parts indicate why this is an important issue. You know, we owe our young people a future. Our world is fractured and confusing. So this position here, by requiring some sort of mandatory civil service, so it doesn't really define in the thesis what that might look like. So we can expect that in the essay itself. Like, okay, well, if not the military, what? Well, we read on to figure that out. But the blue part is the statement or the argument that's being expressed in this thesis, right? Now, keep in mind, this thesis here, you notice, is 3 sentences, right? So it's okay to have a thesis that's more than 1 sentence. It doesn't need to be limited to only 1 sentence. You can have 2 sentences, 3 sentences, and if it's a really lengthy argument, in some cases it might be multiple paragraphs, right? You know, for a book length work, that might be multiple paragraphs in the introduction of the book. But for our purposes, we want to think about 1 to 3 sentences, generally speaking. How has the bicycle influenced my perspective on mobility and community? So this is a little bit more personal, right? So this is the type of thesis for an essay that is a little bit more personal. The argument is personal. It's not necessarily meant to be a broad, universal argument for lots of people. It's just more specific to the personal opinion being expressed in this personal type of essay. So the bicycle is an innovation that not only changed my perspective of mobility in an urban environment, it has given me a stronger sense of community by forcing me to be in the streets, quite literally, among traffic and other people, thus fostering a stronger connection to the city in which I live. So in this case, this is 1 sentence, and I put the argument first that the bicycle is an important innovation because it changed my perspective in this way. But this is the umbrella reason, right? This is the main reason why the bicycle is an important innovation for me. And this helps to signify, it gives an indication of why this is important, right? So even though this particular thesis isn't applicable to everybody, we can still understand why this is important for at least the person writing the essay. And in turn, we can then think about how it might have applications for our own life, you know, if we're reading this. But that's the kind of a more personal style thesis. And then my favorite question here, should pineapple be a topping on pizza? What makes pineapple such an alluring topping for many pizzas is its tangy sweet contrast to the salty savory character of the cheese, which further showcases the incredible versatility of this cherished dish in the United States. So here's the argument that pineapple is an alluring topping for many pizzas. Notice I don't say all pizzas, many pizzas. So your thesis can define the scope. You don't need to necessarily say it's all or nothing, right? You can acknowledge that your argument has a limited application. That's okay. But you define that scope in the beginning. So I'm saying many pizzas. I'm not saying every pizza. So that's the argument, and then this is the umbrella reason, because this tangy sweet contrast, the salty savory character of the cheese. I'm talking about the complementary nature of those 2 things coming together. And then the orange part indicates why this argument is important, because guess what? Pizza is important to a lot of us, right? In the United States, pizza is a very important dish. We eat it in all manner of different occasions. There are different styles of pizza, different places to get pizza, different contexts in which we eat pizza. It's an important dish. And so we can see, okay, I can see how some people might find pineapple alluring on some pizza. I can see that. Now, how do we determine the overarching umbrella reason? This is where the behind the scenes work comes into play. Okay, so what you would do after you've created a draft of your essay, go through the essay and look at all of the supporting points that you have in your essay and just write them down in a list. Just create a list of all the supporting reasons, all the details, the examples that you have to define your argument. What's the main thing that these things have in common? At least most of them. Not every single thing has to be directly related, but most of the reasons, most of the supporting points should have some kind of commonality. So once you figure out what that commonality is, then you can begin to really figure out what the umbrella reason is to support that particular argument, right? But this is stuff that you do after you've done enough research, after you've drafted, after you've thought about this. Again, how could you be expected to respond to a question in a reasonable fashion if you haven't done any thinking about it? If you've never eaten pineapple on pizza, how the heck could you ever have a valid opinion on whether or not it should be a topping on pizza, right? You gotta try it. You gotta do the research. You gotta figure it out. You gotta try different kinds of pizzas with different kinds of pineapple, different flavored, topping combinations, all these different things. You gotta do the research. So the same is true of any essay that we might write. We need to make sure that we do research, we think about it. We're not just committing ourselves to that thesis right at the beginning. And that's where we bring in Miller and Jurecic. Don't commit to a thesis until you've done a significant amount of research, brainstorming, and drafting. As Miller and Jurecic contend, we think the requirement to start an essay by committing to a thesis is a good way to kill curiosity. They go on to state, for your writing to become a mode of learning for you, you must begin in a state of not knowing rather than committing to a claim you came up with before you've done any curiosity-driven research. So again, don't set out, at the very beginning of your process working on an essay, don't confine yourself to a thesis or an argument that you're trying to argue without having done any of that research. Keep it open-ended for the early stages of your essay so that you're more likely to consult a wide variety of sources. You're more likely to look at differing perspectives and kind of weigh the pros and cons of these different things so that you can come to a measured, reasonable response to that research question, which will in turn make your thesis way stronger. All right, y'all. Well, let me know if you have any questions. Catch you on the flip-flop.